Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today. It's Wednesday, July 30th, and my name is Lyric Hughes Hale, Editor in Chief of EconView. I'd like to welcome you all to our morning panel. Elections across Asia Pacific are over, but what comes next? This panel will explore the economic implications of pivotal elections across the Asia Pacific region, from Japan's rightward shift to India's contested mandate, Taiwan's failed recall efforts, and Australia's status quo government. Our experts analyze what political transitions mean for regional stability, trade, investment, and U.S. strategy. We'll be hearing from EconView contributors Marcia Vandenberg and Salia Werakun, who shared their insights on the Indian general election in May. And by the way, we're going to be having a follow-up discussion on that, along with regular contributors, EconView fellows Eleanor Shiori Hughes on Japan and Australia, Eric Huang on the recent KMT victory in Taiwan, and Chicago economist Kareem Pakravan will give us a tour of the Middle East. Rick Katz, who was one of the original contributors to EconView, will share his views on the Japanese election results. Yesterday's earthquake in Russia illustrates the interconnectedness of the Asia Pacific as waves from the tsunami hit the western coast of the United States. Today, we're going to split up our panelists into two groups so that everyone has a chance to ask questions and so that we can record the remarks by our panelists. A replay, just to answer the question I always get, a replay will be available of the panelist remarks, but not the Q&A. So we're going to begin with my friend and colleague, Marcia Vandenberg, on her perceptions of what's going on in India post the elections in May and June. Welcome, Marcia.
Great. Thank you very much, Lyric. I'll jump right in because you've got a heavy schedule. Elections are not top of the mark for India today. Tariffs are. Surprise, surprise. I had prepared these remarks yesterday, and when I last checked, which was last night or late afternoon yesterday, my time in San Francisco, there was no change. Things were still on hold. But that changed overnight, at least overnight for me. And the news this morning, coming out of India and then also coming out of Washington on Truth Social, was a post by Trump claiming the Indians have done relatively little for the U.S. economy in terms of trade, very little business due to their high tariffs, and also complaining about the amount of oil India buys from Russia. And consequently, India now faces a 26% tariff hike come August 1st. That's 25% reciprocal tariffs and an extra 1%, I gather, because of the oil trade with Russia. Things are still in limbo. This is not a final negotiated agreement. This is where the Trump stand now is. We'll see what the Indians come back with. They were just in Washington last week for the fifth round of talks on tariffs. My guess is they'll come there. Not my guess, but my hope. What I read is that they will try to reach some kind of agreement around the 15% tariff agreement that the Trump administration made with both the EU and with Japan, that being sort of a benchmark, what they're kind of working for. At the end of the day, the Indians really don't have anywhere to go other than to find some accommodation with the Trump leverage. They've been leaning on their geopolitical leverage, i.e., their relationship with Washington, built over recent administrations, and then also as a result of Modi's visits with Trump, also leaning on the so-called special relationship between Modi and Mr. Trump. But that now is in question. It's clear the president sees these negotiations in transactional terms and not as part of a larger settlement in terms of other issues to be partners or even allies on, but sees it purely in transactional terms. The word coming out of India as of this morning is some criticism of Modi, asking him to explain this unilateral action on the part of Washington. They don't, Indians don't like it. They have been feeling a little bit miffed by the Trump's claim of responsibility or uh, not responsibility, but claim for taking credit for the resolution of the threats of a cross-border war with Pakistan over the terrorist attack in Indian-controlled Kashmir not too long ago in May, I guess it was. And they feel like that was not Trump's doing as much as their own diplomats talking in this to settle things down. At any rate, their unhappiness with the Trump administration was handled very quietly, and trying to preserve this relationship across the border with Pakistan. I say that because I think this relationship geopolitically between Delhi and Washington is a very important aspect in trying to understand what's happening in India vis-a-vis the rest of the world and vis-a-vis the Trump administration now. This latest on the tariffs really puts kind of another wrinkle in things, and raises questions as to what level the relationship is at going forward from here on in. I think the uh, spotlight is clearly going to be on the relationship going forward. It's and also on the question of where does India go if they don't stay close with the U.S., where do they go from here? So I'll leave it at that, Eric. And there, Lyric, there might be questions, but I'll just pass the baton from there.
Right. Yeah, you had a monkey wrench thrown in your presentation
Yeah,
overnight, didn't you?
that's
Well,
okay.
so that's I know you can handle it. Salia, you're sitting in the region. Has there been reaction to this? And how does this affect Sri Lanka? What are the political issues that you see going on right now?
Uh, Thanks, Lyric. Masha, it's good to be back with you after probably a
Same
year.
here, Asalia. Very good to see you.
So I echo the sentiments of Masha on the Indian side of it. I work on the a few elections in the 2024 from did a lot of work on the India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the US elections as well. In terms of is it surprising how Donald Trump is behaving? I don't think so, because it was probably predictable that what he said in the campaign trail, and he's doing it. But the surprising is the magnitude of the changes, and when you learn U.S. policy on Truth Social, and probably that had never happened before in our history. And so that's quite challenging to understand, because there's an information overload. If you go by what's written, and I believe that everybody have an opinion, and the same way every news channel what we read have agenda as well. When you listen to all these stories, but connecting to the India story in the 4th of June elections, it's not the mandate that Narendra Modi really was looking for, but it was a contested one. Given that the India's resurgence as the fourth largest economy in the world, and there's a lot of pride in India side of it, which I have never seen before. And same way with BRICS coming into play, and the region is a hot potato. I wouldn't say it's politically stable around India. Sri Lanka had a great election. It was a large mandate for a Marxist party for first time in the history, coming from nowhere and winning the election. And Sri Lanka being a uh, geopolitical strategic location where uh, India, China, US, Japan, Russia all wants to have their way. it's been pretty difficult because 2022 Sri Lanka declared, I mean, went through a tough patch and declared bankruptcy as well. So by 2028, Sri Lanka needs to pay their debts to the sovereign bondholders and the private bondholders as well. So that's a question that in Sri Lankan context that is finding it very difficult to handle this tariff issue. One of the reasons our trade balance, we are on a huge deficit. No, I mean, the US side of it is a huge deficit because Sri Lanka exports about $4 billion to USA, and imports are only $400 million. And the tariff from the Sri Lankan is about 88. That landed with 44% to Sri Lanka, and but it was brought down to 30% on the 9th of July. What I hear from both sides is that Sri Lanka in the morning most likely to get about 20%. The best case scenario that you would get about a 15% if all goes well, but with a lot of concessions are required by the USA from the Sri Lankan side. Uh, but there is a China factor in that as well. So whether we can actually agree for US in the all concessions to bridge the deficit, it's a big question from my end. Bangladesh is in turmoil, like in the January elections for fifth time Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. She was elected. It was an election. It was a difficult election, but all know that what happened to her. She had to fled to India, and is a interim government still in play. Bangladesh have a huge tariff block from the US right now. So as Marsha said, that it's all transactional. There's no empathy. There is no rationale in terms of whether places like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh would go through after this tariff issue, whether Sri Lanka, the country like Sri Lanka, actually can go back to China and negotiate different concessions or different trade deals. It's to be discussed after this whole tariff war ends, or probably 1st of August for Sri Lanka. Bangladesh is still in turmoil, and around India, if you take Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives election went on the Chinese way, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi was in Maldives a couple of days before, and the Sri Lankan President Anur Kumar Dissanayake I think he's still in Maldives. And so in terms of politics in the region, is very volatile due to the fact
Mhm.
of the tariff issue from US. But here is the last question for everybody. Everybody is talking about the percentages and tariff, but what I'm thinking about is what after comes after the deal? How do you really implement it? How do you really go back to the supply chain, which is largely owned by the spine of the supply chain is China. China is very silent in Sri Lanka right now. So if even if we get 15% with all the concessions to US, I'm talking about Sri Lankan side of it, what would China do? And I don't think China could leave Sri Lanka in the hands of somebody else, because the BRI, Belt Road Initiative, is cutting across Sri Lankan waters. Like Indian Ocean probably handles about 40 to 45% of the global trade. I leave it there.
Mm. Okay, wonderful, Sally. And I think a great transition to Kareem as well. Speaking of Pakistan, we were just saying that during the earlier remarks that Kareem's father was actually the Iranian ambassador to both your country, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. So, Kareem, we'd really appreciate any insights you have about what's going on in the Middle East. You kind of overlap there with Pakistan, particularly.
Okay. I think that start with three general observations about the Middle East economies, which range from the highly developed Israeli economy to the petromonarchy of the Persian Gulf and the failed states of Yemen and the ailing giant of Iran. These are first, we're talking about the lack of economic integration, separate destinies and diversity, and a surprising resilience to geopolitical risk. I haven't included Pakistan or Egypt or Jordan, but I can talk a little bit about them. I mean, about Pakistan. So we look at Israel first. 21 months into the Gaza war, Israel has defied the dire economic predictions and has prospered. Over the past few years, Israel's economy has been propelled by its increasingly import tech and military tech sector, surge in productivity, armaments exports, U.S. economic support and economic deregulation, and energy self-sufficiency. So the macro numbers look good. I mean, the shekel is up 22% against the dollar since 10/7, and so is the stock market is up 129%. In effect, the economy has inured itself from the Gaza war, which of course is not what the Palestinians have experienced, because it has only been death and destruction for them. And American financial and military support has, of course, helped finance the war, and U.S. unconditional political support has spared the country any difficult decision. The key for, while the economy has been inured from Gaza, the politics has not. And I think the key thing to look at in the next few months is whether or not the Netanyahu government would survive increased pressure from the United States to end the war and come back to some degree of humanitarian help in improvement in the Gaza Strip. Obviously, Netanyahu is unwilling to concede. At the same time, he is blocked by his hard rights ministers, and on the other hand, he's under increased pressure to do something. If you look at the GCC countries, first, of course, oil matters, and we see that first of all, let's realize that the region holds the two largest gas reserves in the world, in Qatar and Iran. And Saudi Arabia, of course, is key in OPEC. So the question will be for Saudi Arabia and other countries, what happens to oil prices? And so far, they've been sort of range bound around $65 to $70. The markets are expected to remain oversupplied. So we're probably going to remain range bound in terms of oil prices. However, the other aspect for the GCC countries has been diversification away from oil. And with oil expected to peak at the end of the decade, you see that Saudi Arabia has a Vision 2030 project, major effort to develop the non-oil sector. And the UAE, of course, and Saudi Arabia are developing non-hydrocarbon economy, including renewables, and they have embraced high tech, in particular AI. And in an effort to leverage their energy and financial heft, with Saudi Arabia and UAE being in the leadership position, and of course they have the money, and they have also the connections. The question is whether or not they can find the human capital resources, the human resources to back this ambitious project. Iran is a very different story. Iran is in the middle of an economic and political and social catastrophe. The 12 Days War has shattered the last vestiges of credibility of the regime, and the country is suffering from a massive water and electricity shortages, a high inflation, and a complete social dislocation. There are no negotiations envisaged with the US, and also the countries are facing snapback sanctions from the Europeans at the end of August if there is no resolution of the nuclear issue, which is unlikely. So expect more economic hardship and dislocation. In the case of Iran, however, there are major developments. There are basically three camps within the regime. There are the hardliners, there are the pragmatists led by the president, and the reformists who want major changes. The pragmatists are trying to move toward the reformists. The hardliners are sidelined for the time being. However, the civic opposition to the regime is very strong, and there are increased demands for major changes in the Islamic Republic, including a referendum and a new constitution. So we could see some major changes in the next few months, and they will come, I think, they will probably surprise us. So
Thank you, Kareem. That's big. That's very important for everybody to, I think, hear.
Yeah, so I think
Wonderful.
the
Yeah.
big, so geopolitics has been sort of the sideline, but it was all, and then you have a deceptive stability, but it could come back at the center, particularly with Gaza and Israel, and then the whole internal situation in Iran.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we've had a lot of information imparted in about 15 minutes. Thank you to the speakers for keeping within your very probably unrealistic time frame. But if you'd like to ask a question, if you want to use the raised hand icon, this would be a good time to do it. Joel, please go ahead and
Yeah, I'd
unmute
like
your microphone. Wonderful.
to ask Kareem. I just read some of what you've been talking about yesterday about the water shortages and the electric shortages being really beyond severe. I'm wondering how much longer they can go on, especially with the water shortages and the drought and the heat, and what's likely to happen because of that.
Well, I think we're already seeing a lot of demonstrations, and basically it increases the pressure on the government to yield to opposition forces, whether within the regime or outside the regime. And I think there will be some developments with the freeing of the people the reformists who are being kept under house arrest, and but I think ultimately it will depend a little bit also what happens within the revolutionary guards. But clearly, for the people, the suffering will continue. I mean, Tehran is like 110 degrees, and it will continue that throughout August and September. So there's no solution there. I mean, the government is going to shorten the work week to 4 days and telling people not to shower and not to flush and whatever. But the reservoirs are at 1/6 of their capacity. So there is no water, basically.
So how much longer can they go on like this? I mean, they can't make rain.
No, you can't. No, I mean, from a practical point of view, people are going to just have to live with it. They can't do anything. From a political point of view, uh, it could basically be what tips the balance towards I would say, uh, ideally, a Pinochet type solution,
Hmm.
which
Eric?
Yes, Marcia.
So I just wanted to add a note following on Salya. I think he raises a really terrific question. What happens after the tariff deals are struck? What happens next? And in the case of India, very dependent on their ability to compete to get supply chains coming. The supply chains that are leaving China to come through involve India and India manufacturing components. And do the Indians now try to really begin to look at the world in world trade, look at it in terms of regional blocks instead of one single block, principally with the US? I mean, they're caught between the two powers, China and India. Their whole claim to leverage with the US as being at the center of that competition. Economically, they're dependent on many things. Their emerging economy trying to grow at 7%. But that ability to now position themselves in the supply chain rivalry that's happening across Southeast Asia, and particularly in parts of South Asia, is going to be key to watch going forward. I just wanted to add that, building on what Salya had to say about what happens next, which I thought was a great question, Salya.
Just one more comment on Iran. This water crisis and electricity crisis is hitting everybody. It's not as if the regime and the upper classes were protected. There's no water, period. No electricity,
It's not
period.
self-inflicted, right? It's just it's
Well, it
because
is
of
actually
natural.
self-inflicted. Years of mismanagement of the electricity. I mean, we have the largest gas reserves in the world, and we have shortage of electricity. It's ridiculous. But the point is that it hits everybody, and then from the commanders of the Revolutionary Guards to the regime hanger-ons to the poor people. Nobody has water, so that's politically, I think, is important.
Mhm. Yeah. And Salia, you'd like to respond?
Yeah, it's a different question, especially talking about Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, where the fragile economies. Sri Lanka is about $100 billion economy. There's nothing actually to take from US. I mean, you can't buy oil, you can't buy LNG, but that's something that it was discussed in the trade deal. And you can't buy pharmaceuticals because the price points doesn't make any sense to buy anything from the US. Even but Sri Lanka's $4 billion to USA exports, that's considers about 25% of Sri Lanka exports. If you lose that 25%, the 4 billion at any given day, even if you have a dip of another $1 billion, Sri Lanka could easily collapse in months, right?
Mhm.
And the question that from this end that I have is that Vietnam is getting a great deal. Indonesia, all is manufacturing, specifically apparel, easily could move into Indonesia or Vietnam at any given time, right? So the question is that if I'm 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 taking Sri Lanka as an example because it's close to my heart. If Sri Lanka gets again fragile in the economy, Sri Lanka has to look out for somebody who could help. Who could help is India and obviously China with the money bags, with a deeper interest in the country. And of course, the other part is Japanese. Uh, Diplomatic ties with Japanese, specifically how Sri Lankan previous governments have treated the Japanese and been in a very difficult and challenging level. So only way that Sri Lanka can sustain is moving to China
Mhm.
and asking for the
Well,
help again.
yeah.
Now, I don't think that this is factored in the US negotiations. I don't know. Maybe they have. Maybe it's a leverage. Maybe there is another strategic intent on handling this whole issue. But it's all, there's so much of ambiguity. That's all what I have to say.
Thank you, Sally. That's really a good lead into Rick Katz to discuss Japan and Japan's interests in this region. And of course, Japan just had an election and is facing its own kind of instability. So, Rick, can you help us understand what's going on in Tokyo
Yeah,
now?
well, so we got two big stories. Let me take a minute or two to talk about tariffs, if you don't mind, and then we'll talk about the elections. Is that all right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
So, there's a really interesting column by Paul Krugman on Substack this morning about how the EU took Trump for a ride, despite all appearances in the contrary of humiliation, which is that what Europe got
Mhm.
was, tariffs at 15% instead of 25%. So the Trump only cut off one of their
Mm,
legs instead of both. But then they
mm,
made all these promises about buying oil and investing, hundreds of billions, which ain't never going to happen. And he explicates why. And the same thing is true of Japan. And the thing is, normally, if you have a trade agreement, you have written down formal agreements which have got to be ratified by the parliaments in both countries. But neither the U.S. Congress nor the Japanese Diet are going to ratify it, so no one's going to, get all the details down there. And so Japan is getting 15% tariffs again instead of 25%. And then they made all these promises they're going to buy, invest whatever, and Trump gets to, you know, decide on 90% of the profits to the US. Trump decides what they invest and blah, 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 blah. And they're going to buy 100 Boeings. None of it's going to happen. It's simply not going to happen. They'll take the lesser evil of 15% instead of 25%, which their largest exporters can tolerate because the yen is so weak, and the smaller ones will be in trouble, and the economy will be in trouble. The U.S. economy, the IMF forecast, is actually also in big trouble from Trump's uh, tariffs. But in any case, none of it uh, amounts to anything except for the tariff being 15%, which is very, very high, and secondly promises that will no more come true than Trump term one, got all these promises of China to buy more US farm products. So it just ain't going to happen. Now,
So, yeah. So, Rick, this morning, U.S. GDP is 3%, which was an upward surprise, but most people think that's because imports tanked after increasing because ahead of tariffs in the first quarter.
yes.
In the second quarter, they went down, but the IMF has changed its forecast for the U.S. on the positive side. I don't know if I just saw that.
Well, it came out, well, it's positive compared to April, when people
Hmm.
thought when they had clocked in 25% tariffs. So because it's
Right.
15%, it's not actually improved, it's just less bad. But if you compare it to, I'm going to have the numbers here if you want to take the time to do it, or we can do it later. But if you compare it to the January forecast, then US GDP is going to be, I think, 20 or 30%. I think it's 30% lower. The growth rate will be 30% lower than it would have been without any tariffs whatsoever. So it's not an improvement in the forecast. It's just a little bit less bad.
Great.
Now, as far as the elections go, what have I got? About 2 minutes left to 3 minutes? What have I got?
Yep. Yeah, 2, 3. You got 3, 4 minutes. Yeah, because
Okay,
it's
good. Well,
complicated.
look,
Japan's complicated.
Japan's been in this long transition for 30 years, which is Japan is the only remaining one-party democracy, one-party dominant democracy in rich countries. And countries have to go through course corrections, and one-party democracies can't do it. So it fell apart in Italy, it fell apart in Scandinavia, it doesn't matter left, right, whatever. Just as you need competition in business markets, you need competition in politics, otherwise you get sclerosis. And that's what Japan has. It's not been able to make transitions. You've had 30 years of a really miserable low growth and dropping living standards for both seniors and very, very much of the working age population. So it's been, how does Japan make this transition from LDP dominance to something else, to really genuinely contested elections? The problem is that the LDP has been absolutely unable to solve the problems. But the LDP, the ruling Liberal Democrats, was a party that ruled as kind of a catch-all party. That is, it divided the growing pie among all constituencies. And therefore, politics was about how do we share the pie? How do we compensate the losers from economic creative destruction so they don't protest too much, whatever. But with low growth, you're trying to share the austerity. The only people gaining are big companies, which get all these tax cuts and other kinds of subsidies. But smaller companies, people, householders are paying higher taxes. Social Security premiums are down. Real wages have been stagnant for 30 years. So it's an awful situation. What makes it even awfuler is that you can't replace somebody with nobody. So that the opposition parties are, partly because of the having proportional representation election system, partly because of their own fecklessness, and some of them just want to exist as a party, don't actually want to take power. You have the opposition very, very split, and doesn't a lot of really good people in it. But when you look at these parties as a whole, the sum is so much less than the sum of the whole is so much less than the sum of the parts. So you're in this situation now where the LDP, in an unprecedented fashion, has within months lost its majority in both houses of the parliament. And yet the opposition parties are not in a situation where they can make a uh, believable play to take power. They don't know what they would do if they took power. Some of them, some of them have some ideas, but a lot of the biggest one doesn't. And the other thing you see, and so you're in this interregnum where I think there's a Russian expression, sitting between two stools. So the LDP is no longer really capable of ruling well, but the oppositions are not able to take its place. And you're sort of stuck. And there's more and more disenchantment among people. And two things have happened that are important sociologically. One is the parties with the largest percentage of older people lost big, and that's the LDP, and that's its ally called the Komeito, and that's the biggest opposition party. And the parties that have gained are the parties that had a larger turnout of people, say, under 40. They turned out and they voted for mostly either a right of center legitimate party called the Democratic Party for the People, but they also voted for two really right-wing, xenophobic, Trumpian parties. One consciously modeling itself after Trump, the expression is Japanese first, right? And this is young people, a lot of them unmarried, unable to get regular jobs. They get these non-regular, low-paid jobs, whatever. A lot of disenchantment. Blame it on somebody. Blame the foreigners. Blame women. Whatever. And it's something which up until now we've not seen in Japan, and now it has arrived. So uh, it's a very turbulent situation, which is wonderful for journalists like me who thrive on uncertainty, because then people want us to pretend we have the answers. But it's awful for the citizens who have to, I mean, for every country that have to live through this. So it's dramatic, but not on the good side, unfortunately.
Okay, well, a disturbing picture, not a very optimistic picture. And
In the
speaking of
long
that,
run, I think
maybe
good things will happen, but the next few years are not going to be good.
are not going to be great. Okay, thank you, Rick, very much. So I'm going to go next to Eric Huang, and then Eleanor Hughes will. Eric's going to speak about Taiwan and what's going on there. Of course, we didn't include China in this. China does not have elections, but China's the elephant in the room. So Eric, maybe you can go on from there.
Sure. I just want to, first of all, kind of follow up on what Richard said. As we all well know, Korea has the Power Party, I think is what it's called, People Power Party, which is led by a 40-year-old youngest presidential hopeful for the next election. But they very much draw upon this hating women, hating social progression, and being super conservative type of sentiment, right? So that is not only in Japan, Korea, it's also in Taiwan, right? But also much of that is framed into this anti-China campaign, right? And I think that is a great segue into talking about the result of the recall election over the weekend. Right? I think this is the first time, probably the last time I ever disagree with Lyric. I don't call this a KMT victory
Okay.
whatsoever. This is not a KMT victory, right? So even though, yes, 24 KMT legislators were on the ballot and zero of them got recalled. And
Right.
as if you read from Western media, in the coming weeks, you would think at least 7 to 10 KMT legislators would have been recalled, right? And the framing of Western media is that Taiwanese voters are very fed up and they're very anti-China and they're acting out and they're going to vote against KMT legislators. That wasn't the case, right? I think what we're seeing Taiwan today is voters are not happy, is a vote of not no confidence to the DPP government, but it doesn't mean that they support the KMT, right? So
To the
these are
ruling party. Yeah.
the ruling party. They have a vote of no confidence to the ruling party, so they voted for the KMT, the opposition, not to recall our legislators. But there is in large and not a support for the KMT whatsoever. So you have seen smaller parties, uh, the Taiwan People's Party, or even the Pen Green, the more independence party, smaller party. They all came out, their supporters came out and voted against this, right? I think one of the biggest reasons why, and I think I can think of two, China is the elephant in the room, even though they don't have elections, but Beidaihe just around the corner. And other thing is obviously this tariff negotiation with the United States, right? Um, I think tariffs is by and large not on a lot of voters' minds. What is the currency exchange, especially Taiwan currency appreciation. So let me just start by thinking from the Trump perspective, right? Over the weekend, Lyric and I talked about this article by Dimitri at Financial Times that President Trump blocked President Lai Ching-te's transit in New York on his way to Central America. So I think, interesting enough, right? I had a conversation with a friend of mine who is close with President Lai. So their explanation, their feel-good explanation, is that the original plan was to use the transit in New York to promote to American audience that Taiwanese voters have spoken about the Chinese pressure, and the new mandate is they recall 7 to 10 KMT legislators. They want to use that framing in this trip in New York. So in their explanation, they called it off, not that Trump blocked them, because they said this narrative doesn't work. But the combination can act together, right? It's like, okay, if Trump, right, this big negotiator, this big real estate mogul from New York wants to go to Beijing and negotiate, right? Lai Ching-te is of no use to him anymore. If Lai Ching-te comes to New York with this new mandate, right, Trump can use that, but now he's of no use. So I think the combination is probably uh, help us understand better, to the truth and the situation. So also from a Trump perspective is that now Lai Ching-te is a weakened president, right? Within his party, people will be challenging him. It's whether from the previous president Tsai Ing-wen's faction, who are very closely aligned with Americans, or the more younger, moderate wings of the party. They are calling for a replacement of a premier, and they are thinking of this successful businessman, Robert Tong. Robert Tong, he has this huge technology company, and I think it's interesting to note that he is a pro-nuclear person, nuclear policy person, right? So in Foreign Affairs Today, Jim Ellis and Stephen Chu, they talk about Achilles' heel in Taiwan is energy. Uh, the DPP government the party has been anti-nuclear for the past 40 years. But it's interesting that people now within the party are pushing Lai Ching-te to replace the current premier with Robert Tong, who has been a nuclear advocate, right? So these are type of dynamic we're seeing. Also, from Trump's perspective, he has to understand that Taiwanese insurance industry holds about 700 billion US dollars in US treasures, treasury bonds, right? So if the the Taiwanese dollar appreciation goes too high, the hedging risk become very costly, and these guys are likely to dump the U.S. bonds, right? On the contrary, they like to see that Trump push for the stable coin as a strategic tool, right? They help them to understand that stablecoin can back the safety and liquidity of U.S. bonds, and they are more likely to keep the dollars, keep buying these U.S. bond dollars, right? So I think the dynamic we're looking at now here is that with a weakened president, how does some of these commercial interests come into negotiation, right? And of course, Lai Ching-te has a strategic decision to make. Does he want to be more like the previous DPP president, Tsai Ing-wen, which is a moderate person who can work with Washington? Of course, Washington has a different president in there. Or he wants to be the first DPP president, Chen Shui-bian, who become very provocative against China and the United States. I think that largely depends on the result of the month to come, 北戴河 in CCP's internal party dynamic, right? Obviously, we're reading
The Seaside meeting, for those who don't know. Yeah.
So
Yeah. The
obviously,
annual meeting.
all this information about Xi Jinping losing power, if President Lai and his NSC team believe that is the truth, he obviously will be more confrontational, right? Otherwise, politically, the situation he is in right now, it makes more sense for him to kind of draw some type of alliances with Taiwan's third largest party, TPP. And TPP actually spun off from Penguin when they first started, right? Ke Wen-je, the mayor of Taipei, used to be a DPP supporter. And then he only running as independent because Taipei is a very KMT predominant party. So they ran him as a independent, as a strategic campaign strategy, right? So
Okay.
these are the things to watch for, and obviously they all have business implications, and these all largely depends on how Trump meet with Xi and how that the negotiation discussion comes with real results and policy implications.
Right. And that meeting is thought to take place in October, potentially. So, Marcia, go ahead.
Could I just jump in just a second to add something, Eric, to your analysis? And that is, I read a column yesterday by Graham Allison, the Kennedy School at Harvard Kennedy School professor, and he is talking about the possible meeting between Xi and Trump and what that could portend. And he's talking about Trump's position vis-a-vis Taiwan. And he reiterates that what we all know, that anecdote of having reporters in his Oval Office pulling up a Sharpie pen and putting a dot on a piece of paper on his desk and saying, that dot is Taiwan, the rest of the desk is China. One point that Allison made in support of his contention that this could be a very favorable summit if it takes place, a very favorable summit that could lead to a much calmer relationship between the US and China, is that Trump's position on Taiwan is more compatible with the Chinese than any president before him. And that could leave Taiwan very uneasy. And I'm just wondering if there's I know the concerns are with the currency, but is there really a concern about what could happen? Lies in a weakened position now, but could he be in an even weaker position going into this summit, particularly if Trump's attitude is dismissive of Taiwan?
Thank you, Marcia. Well, I always agree with Professor Allison. I took his course. I really enjoyed it. So I think the answer is probably more complicated than what Graham is suggesting, right? I think his conclusion that a closer U.S.-China relations might make Taiwan uneasy might not resonate with everybody in Taiwan. I say that with two observations, right? Number one, I've been on record for years saying that the current U.S.-Taiwan relations focuses too much on the military front of it, and military alone will not deter the Chinese if they ever decided for a military conflict or invasion, right? So military is not alone, right? So what Grant Allison is talking about here is that if President Trump is more willing to kind of make compromises on Taiwan's behalf towards China, I think he's talking more about military commitments, right? But we also have to think about Taiwan itself has a cross-strait policy and cross-strait relations and dynamic, right? And I think if so, in the past, Trump is obviously something different, but in the past 40 years, ever since Taiwan Relations Act, what we see is if you have a better U.S.-China relations, you have a better cross-strait relations, right? So if in order for Grant's element to make sense, right, there are two pillars. One pillar is that U.S.-Taiwan relation, cross-strait relations, is simply relying on military. That's number one. And number two is that if the United States don't support Taiwan militarily, the Chinese will come over Taiwan tomorrow. I think both pillars I reject, but don't tell Professor Allison I said that. But if he told me in private, I would
Why
say, well,
not?
I disagree.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think that was a really good counterpoint there. That was great. So, and that's a great segue to Australia, our final destination on this tour of the horizon of Asia Pacific, and they had a very interesting election as well. Eleanor, would you like to comment on that and how this relates, that election and what's going on in the U.S. relates to Australia and
Sure.
their
Just
economy?
sounds good. Can you hear me, first of all?
We can. We know you're outside, but it looks nice out.
I do apologize, and I apologize for running late. I actually just went to a talk with Trump's science technology advisor to talk about and hear his remarks about the AI action plan. For anybody interested, I would highly recommend reading the AI action plan. I highly also recommend watching the video, the recording of the event I just attended. I'll send the link to Lyric, and hopefully she can circulate it, because I'm using my phone, so I
I will.
can't. Great, that's wonderful. And I also, funny enough, I just went to the Australian embassy, so this is literally the perfect time to just have this chat. So I'll start with a little bit before the election. So several weeks before the election season started, because unlike the United States, which we already have congressional members or eager prospective congressional members already starting their campaigns. Australia is not the same case. So in Australia, this year, the campaign was only 5 weeks long. So one of the reasons I would say is probably because, unlike the States, voting in Australia is compulsory. In other words, all Australians have to vote whether they like it or not. My understanding with the voting structure is that they vote based on like their preference, as opposed to like in the States, you vote just one person and go on, and then you go on from there. So
Rank
weeks
choice.
before, and weeks before the campaign season started, and the election was on May the 3rd. Even the election date wasn't selected until right before the campaign started. That's how it works there. There was a Chinese flotilla going across the Tasman Sea, conducting live fire exercises, and that really spooked Australia and, of course, New Zealand, because those are the two countries that where the Tasman Sea is located. Diverting commercial airlines, and it was actually a pilot, I think, from one of the commercial airlines that supposedly alerted Australian intelligence about the situation, and subsequently these ships circumnavigated Australia for the first time. The reason why I'm mentioning this and why this is important is because at the time, many Australian observers, commentators, whatnot, kind of thought that this would give a leg up for the coalition that is at the time the opposition party, and we now know is still currently the opposition party. Because in Australia, the coalition, I should say, they're kind of considered the champions of defense. That is not to say that the Labour Party does not advocate for stronger Australian defense per se, but within Australian policy circles or eager observers of Australia, I think that's kind of like the coalition's bread and butter. But unlike 2022, where the Solomon Islands China deal was a real strategic shock, and I think that did to some extent help Anthony Albanese, or Albo, go forward. One, I don't think that was the case with this Chinese ship circumnavigating Australia. I think because typically in Australian elections, foreign policy does not feature prominently. I think that is probably pretty much the case with many countries in their respective elections, but 2022 was a little bit of a game changer in that regard because of the Solomon Islands China deal. This time around, I think, Australians would say that Trump played a factor because of the tariff negotiations, Albanese's inability to get exemptions. I mean, during one of the debates that he had with Peter Dutton, who was the then opposition leader, Albanese's pitch with regard to Trump and tariffs was that, Australia was one of the countries that was on the baseline 10%. So he saw that as a win. It could have been way worse, as he put it. I'm sure I'm paraphrasing him there a little bit. But Peter Dutton was like, well, you need to go meet with President Trump, like the way Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba, India's, Narendra Modi, and other leaders have kind of gone all the way to DC. And so on May the 3rd, of course, Australian voters, they had their what's called the democracy sausages, went to vote. And what was surprising was that when the Chinese flotilla shift was happening around that time, Dutton was favored to be the victor. That's what the polls are suggesting. I think people for the most part knew that if Albo won, that there would be a hung parliament. In other words, the victory or the amount of seats that Labor had versus that of the coalition, the Liberals, would be narrower. But the exact opposite happened. So people were very surprised. Even those who are seasoned, I would say, Australian domestic politics observers were quite surprised by how much Albo won, including the Labor Party and their representation in the parliament now in this day and age. Also, as a side note, fun fact, Australia just also elected their youngest parliamentarian. She's 21 years old from South Australia. Because in the States, you can't be 21 years old and be a lawmaker. But that's another interesting, just a side note that I wanted to mention there. But so now that Albo's won, he is also the first prime minister to have won after serving a full term in, I would say, over 20 years. So that's a big deal. I think that speaks to Australian voters, the average voter, thinking that we don't want this big change that Peter Dutton might perhaps be advocating for, whether it's public servants returning to Canberra, working fully in person in the way that now Trump has kind of mandated here in BC, whether it be maybe nuclear was an issue too. I know Lyric and I, we've talked quite extensively about the energy situation in Australia. And in some cases, I think some people kind of associated Dutton and his coalition associates with that of Doge and a little bit of Trump and MAGA. Even one of the coalition parliamentarians, Jacinta Price, who is Indigenous, by the way, she did say "Make Australia Great Again" as a slogan. I don't know if the rest of the party fully embraced that actual slogan, but she did say that in public. That may have turned some people away. You never know. But so I think, right after the election, there's a lot of soul searching going on in the Liberal and the coalition party. There was a split. My understanding is that was kind of short-lived, but I think that just shows how much inter-party fissures there are within Australian politics. Australian politics can definitely be a blood sport, as Lyric knows all too well, I would assume. And so I think right after the election, people thought that, Albo is going to be warmly embraced and everything he does is great from a foreign policy standpoint. But that's not exactly the full story here, because even though he may have won and his party won to the extent that there's still a lot of looming questions and I would say structural challenges that Australia under his administration is going to have to grapple with. One of which is about taxation with the superannuation fund. That was the talk of the, Canberra was taking, a lot of people in Canberra are talking about that. I don't know if they still are at this point, but even more importantly, from a US-Australia alliance standpoint, there's a very lively political debate going on in Canberra and Australia's foreign policy circles about the state of AUKUS. So a few months ago, once again, Dimitri from the Financial Times, who does great scoops, by the way, he works in the same building that I work at, by the way. But he was the one that broke the story about OSD, Office of the Secretary of Defense Policy, leading a AUKUS review. And I knew that when I first saw that story, because it was still nighttime in Australia, that when the Australians woke up, that would be the top of the news, and it was. And it's understandable that it was, because they look at the states as its security guarantor, and AUKUS is kind of become the stamp of the alliance, for better or worse. But so now there's, this AUKUS review is sparking a huge debate about the virtues or the pitfalls of Australia from a sovereignty standpoint, from a financial standpoint, because Australia has given the US two big payments, like two down payments, I guess you could say. But there is no guarantee, I guess, to be fair, that these submarines will be delivered by the timelines that were initially announced. But on the other hand, there are people who are saying, well, don't hyperventilate over all these things going on the US end, namely the review or the people who are taking over, who are part of the DoD, namely Bridge Colby, and those types of things, or the fact that Trump and Albo haven't met. And I'll end it there by saying, unlike Albo, now that he's been reelected, there is a lot of concern among many commentators about the fact that Albo has not yet met with Trump. The election's out of the way now, right? he went to the Vatican right after the election because of the new Pope. And some people are quite concerned that he went to China first. And more specifically, he went to China for as long as he did. I think it was about a week. And some people have even branded him as kind of like a panda hugger or as a tourist who was trying to emulate that of one of his predecessors, Go Whitlam, who was a prominent Labour Party prime minister from the 20th century, but has not yet come to DC to meet with Trump in person. Some people are quite concerned about that because there are really big questions that are looming regarding the alliance, and not just about AUKUS or not just about tariffs per se, but energy. I would think is a big one as well. So I'll run there to see
Okay.
what we are as I start.
Okay. Well, wonderful. So, just to kind of sum things up, what I'm taking away from everybody's remarks is that there's no doubt that the Trump tariffs have been an earthquake in the region. But what what I think everybody's giving you in terms of background in these particular countries is that domestic issues are just as important. And to Marcia's point, after the tariff issues all die down and are all negotiated, those domestic issues that relate to energy, to resources, as Kareem was talking about, water, those remain. And an interesting thread through the conversation was about the new generation coming into power, younger people coming into political power, and that their views of the world might be different than their predecessors. And that could be a big change. So after the deluge, these things will persist. And, the question is, what does that mean to the U.S. economy? And also, the other thing that will persist is the need for countries, even as big as India, to navigate between the competing interests of the U.S. and China. Taiwan, of course, is the prime example of that need to balance. Thinking about the dollar and what that means, I think that could be the biggest consequence of what's going on. What Eric mentioned about, hedging and so forth, the fall in the dollar. What does that mean in terms of our relationship with other countries in Asia Pacific? So if the U.S. and China are able to come to a nice status quo in the coming months and when they meet in October, that will be, that will definitely help things. But it seems that there are other challenges, demographic challenges in particular, that will persist even after all the negotiations are over. So with that, I'd like to ask if anybody else has any other questions or comments. Please raise your hand or just start talking.
Well, I would.
Rick,
Lyric?
you look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I always do. What was surprising to me was just in terms of Japan, when you did a survey of the issues on people's minds, the Trump tariffs are way, way, way down as a priority. So even though the impact is very huge, that's not what people were voting on. They were voting on these domestic pocketbook issues, price,
Right.
inflation, and I submitted to Toyo Keizai the article that I did about just put out about the Trump tariffs, and they said no, we don't want it. Readers just are not interested in that. So that is a surprising thing, and people turning much more internally. I'm not sure if it's true in other countries as well, whether that was a big issue or in the elections, but not in Japan.
Well,
So
we'll
could I
publish
just
the
add,
article for sure. But go ahead, Marcia.
I'm sorry, Eric has had his hand up, but just as a follow on to what Rick was saying, I think in India, we will not be surprised to see public criticisms, if not just critiques, then criticisms of Modi's relationship with Trump and the fact that this was a unilateral decision out of Washington after negotiators were just in Washington. In other words, my point is that tariffs are the handling of tariffs, the politics of the tariffs and the relationship is very much on people's mind again, it's the policy intelligentsia, if you will, maybe the Liberal Party, the parties, not the BJP as much as the others, but that's the top of the headlines that I was looking at this morning before I came on were members of parliament calling Modi to explain why this unilateral decision came down when the Indians were expecting some sort of special relationship to intervene before 26% tariffs get handed them. So just to add that,
Okay.
that in India at least, there's conversation about it.
Okay, Eric, you've got your hand up.
Right. I wanted to say three things to add to kind of conclude this our discussion. Right. One is that similarly to the United States, that during 2024 presidential election, I was in Cambridge. Though I would admit that I go into some of these discussions with a bias, but there are a lot of surprising Trump supporters on either Harvard or MIT campuses. These are young and what you will call educated and coming from strong or wealthy families, right? You see that in East Asia nowadays. Younger people are participating in politics more, but not necessarily as what you would expect progressive to the society. They are even more conservative. You can call it nationalistic, or you can think of as they want Taiwan first, they want Japan first, or Korea first, right? I think that's the first observation I want to throw in here. The second observation is I still believe, right, United States intelligence community is probably one of the strongest in the world. So if Trump makes that trip to China, which suggests that all these rumors about Xi Jinping losing power has no legs to it. Otherwise, it makes no sense for him to travel there, right? If you read all these Chinese speculations like Epoch News, this and that, they're saying basically Xi Jinping is under house arrest. So why would President Trump meet with a Chinese leader that has no influence whatsoever, that can make no decisions, right? I think this is another observation I want to throw out there. The last thing I want to conclude my remark is what I believe. I think fundamentally, a more multipolar international order is actually helps cross-strait stability. Quite a contrary of what Grant Allison is suggesting, right? I think the psychology for Beijing is that if we have this superpower United States backing Taiwan, we might be a smaller player here, but we want to do everything to prove that we are not a segment of Asia. This 100 years of humiliation, we want to take that back. But if you think of the international order being United States is decreasing its influence, European is rising, also the Chinese is rising, they have other considerations to come in than just Taiwan. And if Taiwan can present to China that, the relationship between us is not just military defense against your PLA, is that we can have other type of interactions, economic, people to people. Like I said before, military is one pillar of the deterrence, not 100%. And I think that can actually help cross-strait relations.
Yeah.
Okay, Kareem, it looks like you're anxious to say something, and then I'll go to Eleanor for the last word.
Very briefly, I think to follow up on Richard's point, the important thing is not just these tariffs, so-called deals, but it's a follow-up. And I think that the U.S. is going to have a difficult time following up. And they don't have the people, and they don't have the attention span. I think Trump doesn't have attention span. So a
You
few
mean
months
enforcement too? Yeah.
not just enforcement, you're getting, what happens if Europeans basically say reject the deal? Then we're going to have more chaos down the line 6 months from now. What if the Indian parliament rejects the deal? What if the Japanese diet rejects the deal? So we're going to have more chaos in the future. And other point is that basically you could say August 1st is officially the end of the rule-based trade system in the world.
Oh, that's a strong statement. Okay, and
Lara, just to correct,
Yes?
the Japanese Diet will not be voting on it. But
Okay.
as far
They
as
do
we're
not
designed,
have to.
neither Congress nor the Diet have any power in this
No, I know,
issue.
but the other side have. I mean, Europe, they have to get a majority of countries to agree.
That
And
may be true in Europe, but it's not true in Japan
right.
or the U.S.
Yeah.
Okay. So last, Eleanor, we ended with you and the speakers, and now you had one more thing you wanted to say.
Great, thanks. So just to kind of piggyback a little bit on what you and Eric said about young people. So one of the things that really intrigued me right after Trump was elected was that when I was in Canberra a few days after the U.S. election last year, and I was a featured speaker of a roundtable at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And an hour before, I think an hour or two before the roundtable started, I was thinking about what would my remarks be. And one of the first things I said was how kind of astonished I was by the nominees of Trump's kind of upcoming cabinet. They were pretty young. They were like, millennials to the lower end of, what is it, Gen X? No, maybe Gen whatever. The generation of millennials. So people under 55 or under, Marco Rubio is one of them. Pete Hegseth certainly is one of them. At the time, I think Mike Waltz may have been nominated to the NSA, but I can't remember. USTR. So I think part of that, I thought that was quite astonishing because, in the previous Trump, Trump 45, that wasn't really a prevalent feature of his cabinet or his closest associates. This time around, I think, a lot of young voters turned up and voted for him. I think maybe Eric alluded to that a little bit. So part of it, I think, is he wants to make sure that he maintains that connection with his base, but also who better to maintain that bridge than younger people who are part of his cabinet, or if they're not a part of the cabinet, but at the highest echelons of the Trump administration. That's number one.
Right.
Number two, someone mentioned about demographics. So one of my friends, Dr. Andrew Oros, he's releasing a book, I think August or September, about demographics, mainly in the Indo-Pacific. So if any of you are interested in that, I highly recommend reading.
We should do a podcast with him. Right.
Well, I've already asked him that, Lyric, by the way. So dang, I just spoiled that.
Good.
And the third thing was about, I think some of you talked about how tariffs, or how people are thinking about Trump and tariffs. So when the U.S. election happened last year, one thing I was monitoring was how were people from all across Asia and Oceania reacting to Trump's reelection. Australians tend to be more outrightly negative in their impressions and perceptions about Trump. My impression with Japan, but I'll defer to Rick since he's, I think, a much closer observer of Japanese media than I am, but I don't think they're outwardly the same level of negative. India, I will defer to Martha, but I'll defer to everyone else with other countries. But I like to see it as a spectrum, and how that spectrum, if it maintains during the Trump administration, not just like in the immediate aftermath of the election. But I do think that the public opinion part does matter, because I think that's one of the reasons why, if you're looking at Australia, for example, it's a bit of it was phenomenal, I would say, that Alba won to the extent that he did. And part of it, I think, was because on voters' minds, they have a certain resentment of Trump that maybe other people from other countries just don't think first and foremost. Not that they don't have those feelings, but they don't act on it in the way that maybe Australians, or even who knows about South Korea. Yeah.
And Salia, you have your hand up, so I'm going to give you 30 seconds to wrap up, since we're just at time now. Oh, you're on mute. Salia, you're on mute.
I just need
there
20 seconds, Lyric.
20 seconds. Okay. You got it.
We all talk about numbers, but we have never spoken about, the whole world have not spoken about people. Asia is 4.2 billion people. And if they go through a suffering, and always when the hunger comes in, there comes rebellions.
The other thing, too, that I wanted to mention, a big picture thing, as you know, since maybe 2022, I've been writing that I think that the Chinese economy, much as the Soviet economy, was weaker than we thought. During Reagan's administration, I wonder, and I believe actually, that China's economy is quite weak. And some of the things that we're going to see come into play coming up soon will be the effect of the investment tax credits and so forth in the U.S., which could mean that the U.S. economy continues to strengthen. So that will be an interesting part of the interplay between the U.S. and China going forward. So anyway, thank you, everybody. This was a great discussion, and we'll be hopefully distributing it widely. I think I learned a lot from everybody, so I'm hoping all of our listeners do too. Thank you for joining, and if everybody would, anything that you mentioned that you'd like to add to the podcast replay, books, etc., I'm very happy to post those as well. And Rick, your article, would love to have that if you haven't posted it already. Okay, thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you.